All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. Today is the Bill Warmington lectureship, and I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Hal Quinn, who is one of our wonderful community pediatricians from Mercer Island Pediatrics, who has invited our speaker, and he's going to do the introduction about the lectureship and the speaker. So thanks, everyone, for being here, and I will turn things over to Dr. Quinn. Remember, as always, mute and put your questions in the chat box for the end of the presentation. Thanks, you guys. Here's Hal.
Good morning, everyone. So happy to be here and see you all this morning. This lecture honors Bill Warmington, who finished his residency in pediatrics at Seattle Children's Orthopedic Hospital in 1953. It was known as the Orthopedic back then. He was a beloved community pediatrician who practiced in the Seattle area from 1953 to 1984. He became a clinical professor of pediatrics in 1960 and was president of the Children's Medical Staff in 1969. He was selected by the House staff as outstanding teacher in 1973. Bill attended Grand Rounds most Thursdays for many years. When we were proximate doing this, I would point up to the seat where he sat, but next year maybe. No matter how esoteric the topic, he usually had a comment or a question drawn from a case he astutely recalled from his many years in practice. His memory was sharp, his sense of inquiry keen. He was the living embodiment of a quote I once heard in Grand Rounds: "A vivid anecdote outweighs any clinical trial." Maybe some debate about that, but hopefully you know what I mean. The lecture also honors the role of community pediatricians in the lives of their patients and their families. I'd like to give thanks to the Warmington family and to all those who made donations to create the lectureship. This year has taught us many things. As I mulled over some of the lessons of the pandemic, two things occurred to me. Being stuck inside all day is not good for our bodies, minds, or souls, particularly not good for those of children. And being outside was often safer than being inside. And also that animals, both domesticated and wild, can be great sources of comfort when we are isolated from others. And so the inspiration for the speaker for the Warmington lecture this year was born. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Richard Louv. Mr. Louv is a journalist and an author of 10 books, including Our Wild Calling: How Connecting with Animals Can Transform Our Lives and Save Theirs, and Last Child in the Woods: Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. He is co-founder and chairman emeritus of the Children in Nature Network, an organization helping to build the movement. In 2008, he was awarded the National Audubon Medal, which is given in recognition of outstanding achievement in the field of conservation and environmental protection. This medal was launched in 1947 and is one of the highest honors in conservation. Mr. Louv, if you will.
Thank you, Hal. And Hal, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Well, first, we don't know where we're at in the pandemic, what point we're at. I hope it's winding down as you do. But something peculiar happened during the pandemic that wasn't expected. Certainly, those of us who've been advocating for nature as a healing force for children did not anticipate it, which is suddenly it wasn't so hard to convince people that nature experience was good for their health, their mental health, their physical health, and I would argue their spiritual health as well. But seemingly overnight, people have discovered it. Many people have looked out their window and noticed that there were birds out there. Birds were there all along, but suddenly they took comfort from the presence of those birds. They looked out onto the streets, and city after city, you've heard all these tales of lions walking down the middle of the street, animals that they had never seen before, including large predators, showing up right in the cities. The assumption was that all of these animals had come in suddenly from the outside the city to be somewhere where it wasn't so loud anymore, where there weren't as many people around because they were all inside. some of that is true, but most of those animals were here all along. In the new book, Our Wild Calling, I talk about what I call the betweens. These are the animals that are more or less in between domestic and wild. They're all around us. Birds, of course, have been forever, but increasingly wild animals have been moving into cities, and we've been moving into their territory. So they're already here. This is one of the reasons why I always caution that when we talk about nature, we shouldn't just talk about Yosemite. We should talk about even the alleyways in the densest urban neighborhood, or the windowsill across the street, where someone in a high-rise watches a hawk build a nest. I wrote a piece for the LA Times that ran in July about this, about the discovery of animals all of a sudden by many people who had not seen it, and also the recognition of nature. Again, not just Yosemite, but nearby nature. If they were lucky enough to have a yard, they noticed there was nature there. And person after person told me stories of how this was comforting them, how this was helping them get through the pandemic, and their kids, often especially their kids. I think there's a deep reason for that goes beyond the pandemic, and the pandemic is making us aware of this. Also, I should add, as many of you know, the trailheads now are packed. People are pouring into parks now that they can get out a little bit more, to the extent that some rangers in those parks are a little concerned about the trash that's left behind and all of that. For a generation that didn't have a lot of nature when it was growing up, this is new, and it's understandable that some damage would be done. But I think I've argued among some of my colleagues that it's important to start emphasizing that it's not just a matter of enjoying nature, seeing it and being in it. We've got to take care of it. We've got to leave more than we took. This deeper reason is that, as many of you know, human isolation has become an increasingly important topic in healthcare. And that sometimes it's called an epidemic, and sometimes that word is controversial when applied to human loneliness, but I call it an epidemic. And it's interesting that that is paralleling the pandemic right now. It's probably a pandemic around the United States, around the world too, this human loneliness. What this is often blamed on, or first I should say this, human isolation is now associated with all kinds of diseases that usually are related to smoking or obesity. But increasingly, this human isolation is seen as a real public health issue. The blame for that is often given to, you can't blame everything on Mark Zuckerberg. It's not just anti-social media. It's also bad urban design. Seattle's a little bit better than San Diego. I've lived in Seattle for a couple of years in the late 80s. But where I live outside of San Diego, you can't walk very far without running into a freeway. So the ability to get out is often restricted by urban design. This is particularly true in terms of equity in those neighborhoods that have been neglected in terms of public parks and all of that. And also so many of the parks, public parks, are soccer fields. Nothing against soccer fields, but we need more natural parks in our cities. Seattle has quite a few of them. San Diego has more in its share too. It's also a problem, this human isolation of the disintegrating extended family. The uncles and aunts that used to live in the same town. the friendship networks that held communities together. As communities have fragmented, those networks, support networks, have often disappeared. And of course, what's happened to the nuclear family is part of this. But I think that there's something deeper going on here. And that's one of the themes of the new book of Our Wild Calling. I think that we are suffering, and have for some time, from something called species loneliness. This is deeper, perhaps, than individual loneliness. As a species, we are desperate not to feel alone in the universe. Why else would we look for Bigfoot? And by the way, I've spent some time with Bigfoot hunters in the Northwest, and they're fascinating folks. But what is it they're really looking for? Obviously, some of them are looking literally for Bigfoot, but I think there, again, is a deeper reason. Why else would we look for intelligent life on other planets? You know, when Stephen Hawking tells us it might not be a good idea to find that intelligent life on other planets, it's because as a species, we're desperate not to feel alone in the universe. Turns out we're not alone. We're just not paying attention. There is a great conversation going on all around us, mainly animals, including wild animals for sure, but also plants. The more that is known about animal communication and plant communication, particularly trees, the more fascinating the science is on that, the more we know that we're not alone in the universe. So this is one of the reasons I think people have turned to wildlife, and as well as their pets. As you know, the animal shelters are cleaned out. My wife and I started trying to get a dog, which I'd always wanted to get for years, another one. And we couldn't find one that would fit us, our needs. And we had so few dogs to select from. That's across the US. People have turned to their pets, to shelter animals, and to wildlife. Over the last few years, there has been a huge increase in the amount of research that connects health and well-being, as well as education, cognitive functioning, to experience in nature. I wrote Last Child in the Woods. It was published in 2005. And when I was researching it, I could find about 60 studies that I felt comfortable citing in that book. And I was very careful which ones I picked. I was not cherry picking. There weren't that many to begin with. I called what was resulting from the disconnection of children and nature a disconnection we've never seen in human history, which has happened over the recent decades. I called the result of that nature deficit disorder, and I'm always careful to qualify that. Was in the book, and I am ongoing, which is this is not a known medical disorder. Maybe it should be considered that, but not yet. It is, though, a way to talk about this thing that has been happening for a long time. And before nature deficit disorder, that phrase, people had a hard time talking about it. Where do you hang your hat on that issue? 10 years ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics asked me to give their keynote speech at their national meeting. I was astounded. Nature deficit disorder, really? This is mainly based on science, but it's also anecdotal evidence. But I was very surprised to be asked to speak on that. So when I spoke about it, I talked about how important doctors are in terms of children, particularly pediatricians and family pediatricians, that they are among the only people left, I think, that most people trust, that certainly parents. It's not so easy with inoculations, I know that. But it's an extraordinarily important population of extraordinarily important people in terms of making the case that connecting your kids to nature and yourself is not only healthy, but probably essential to your health, to your humanity. Not everybody. This isn't a panacea, but the research has exploded. As I say, in 2005, there were about 60 studies I could find, both on the disconnect, but also on the benefits of nature. Now there are over 1,000 studies. If you go to the Children Nature Network, which is childrenandnature.org, you'll see a research library there. Children Nature Network is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods to try to help support the movement, the national movement, and now an international movement to connect kids to nature. If you go to that website, look at the research site. We've got abstracts to over 1,000 studies. These abstracts were written first with the help of people at Yale University and now University of Minnesota. We're very careful, again, about not overclaiming the research. So it's done independently of us. I have no influence on that. But those studies are remarkable, and they all seem to point in the same way, that this is fundamental to our kids, to us, for health, cognitive functioning, psychological health, physical health. If I could mention some of what is both going on in the medical field, but also in terms of the research itself. Some of you may have read about Robert Zarr, Dr. Robert Zarr. He's the founder and medical director of Park RX America. He was at the speech that I gave, and it got a far better reception than I would have dreamed. A lot of the pediatricians lined up to get the book, which was great. But many of them told me they were going to go home and change their practice. One of them was Robert Zarr. He went back to DC and he began to write literally nature prescriptions. Now, that word prescription, I know, is not favored by some medical professionals. Maybe we only prescribe pharmaceuticals. But those who don't want to use that word, they just say this is a recommendation. So Robert Zarr literally began to write prescriptions. Then he organized the pediatricians of Washington, D.C., and they began to write prescriptions. But he went a step farther. Those doctors created a database of all of the parks and open space in Washington, D.C., so that the doctor could not only encourage the family to get outside, but turn to the computer behind her or him and say, there's a park a block and a half from your house. Here's what you can do there. In Oregon, in Portland, Oregon, and this was a pilot program. I don't know if this is still going on. I need to find that out. But the park department there, the urban park department, started to partner with the local physicians who were writing recommendations for families to get outside, go to nature. And with the family's permission, the park department would call the family when they got home and say, here's what we can do for you. Come to the park on Saturday, this particular park or that one. And our park rangers are now acting as park health paraprofessionals, a role they really like. They were doing it all along, but to formalize that, recognize that and to honor that is something new. And they were helping people get their green exercise. Stephen Pond, who is a pediatrician in Austin, Texas, and he's a very prominent pediatrician there. He prescribes nature as what he calls stealth health intervention. In natural settings, he said that children can engage in health improving activities without even realizing it. And he recommends to his fellow doctors, give kids a healthy snack and time outdoors in nature. And many medical problems can be prevented or at least improved. And these problems range from attention deficit disorder. Some of the earliest research was done on attention deficit disorder. They found that just a little bit of contact with nature, urban kids walking through an urban park, walking through trees in an urban park, their symptoms of attention deficit would get better, even kids as young as 5 years old. Vitamin D deficiency, cardiovascular health, and mood disorders. As founding chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics, Stephen Pont, on their section of obesity, Pont has encouraged the AAP to establish a nature and child health group for pediatricians interested in, quote, increasing the amount of time that our patients spend in nature, unquote. He bases his argument on common sense and hard science. And he says, a growing evidence base is now documenting the mechanisms and impact, the how, for what we've always known, that we feel better after spending time in nature. I'll just list some of the things that the research shows. Climbing on logs can improve balance and core strength and give a sense of accomplishment. Turns out that natural play spaces often provide better exercise than jungle gyms, than the typical playground with the asphalt or cement covering. Says building a treehouse can teach the basic physics of building. Watching a bee move from flower to flower can teach about pollution. A lot of this is education too, and the dividing line between health and education is very slim, if there's any dividing line really at all. Kids will learn better if they're healthier, and there's something about nature that is natural environments. There's something about that has some kind of mysterious ingredient than regular exercise does not have. Research done on young adults getting exercise. They studied one group, and several studies showed this. One group indoor gym on treadmills compared to another group who were outside getting their green exercise. Hiking, gardening, whatever. Both of those groups were expending exactly the same number of calories. Both of them got better in many ways, blood pressure, et cetera, psychological well-being. The young people who were doing their green exercise, expending the same amount of calories, who were outdoors, got even better. There was a marginal, there was a measurable change, improvement for those who were doing green exercise outdoors. Some of the other research, urban children with more access to natural areas as well as nature in the home and school environment have lower stress levels than would be expected if nature was not acting as a protective factor. Park prescriptions, as I mentioned, for low-income families lead to a significant increase in resilience, a more balanced response to stress, regardless of level of adverse childhood events. Spending time outdoors increases children's chances of experiencing moments of happiness. This study, involving 10,000 children using sensors that they wore on their body, suggested that the odds of experiencing what were called happy moments were 2.4 times larger in public open spaces, such as open fields and plazas, than in commercial areas like malls. For young adults, the more nature experienced over a 14-day period, the more daily awe they experienced and the greater life satisfaction they reported. As many of you know, the study of awe has grown in recent years, and awe, more than any other positive emotion, is now related to daily life satisfaction. Awe in nature heals. Two of the characteristics of the places and experiences that result in awe, that sense. One of them is people get out of their comfort zone. The second one is they may feel a little sense of danger, concentrates the attention. Nature gives us that, and I never say that nature is totally safe. It's not. I have mountain lions right outside my window. I live up in the mountains east of San Diego. Research now suggests that healthy urban ecosystems can lead to more cohesive neighborhoods, reduced aggression, lower crime, reduced attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, and other mental and physical health indicators. Experiences in the natural world may serve as a buffer to depression and anxiety, help prevent or reduce obesity and myopia, boost the immune system, improve social bonding, and reduce social violence. I should say here that I try very hard not to use words like prove. Most of this evidence is correlative, but it's very rare for a growing body of evidence that is correlative, and some of this is not correlative, it's direct cause. But it's very rare for this much correlative evidence, as one researcher told me, to point in the same direction. Improving social bonding and reducing social violence. One of the more interesting studies has been done of natural play spaces at schools. And what they found is these natural play spaces have grass and maybe a garden, and it's outside classrooms, for instance. Those natural play and learning environments compared to the typical playground, which is asphalt and concrete and metal jungle gyms and all of that. They found that kids who played in natural play spaces were far more likely to invent their own games than the kids who played in the typical traditional playground. That's extraordinarily important for the development of executive function, which is that the brain's ability to be its own boss. This has something to do with entrepreneurs. It has something to do with a sense of personal agency. I think it has something to do with the future of the economy. If we can turn this disconnect, this generational disconnect with nature around, I think on down the road, we're going to see economic benefits of that. And that's obviously speculative. More than 50 studies point to nature-based play as key to developing pro-environmental behavior, particularly by fostering an emotional connection to nature. I should add that natural play spaces, one of the things they also noticed, in addition to more likely to invent their own games, was the kids were far more likely to invite other kids to play with them who were of a different race, different gender, different culture. That's where nature plays a role in social bonding. This issue is especially important because the one about pro-environmental behavior, because the health and educational benefits of natural environments appear to be particularly evident among children and communities under the most stress. A 2018 review of the research by UK researchers examined studies involving more than 290 million people of all ages from 20 different countries. Their analysis revealed that exposure to green space was linked to significant reductions in diastolic blood pressure, stress-related I'm saying these wrong, salivary cortisol, heart rate, and diabetes. In addition, their survey indicated that green space exposure reduces the risk of preteen birth, premature death, and high blood pressure. Again, that was in areas in which there's a lot of stress. Poor neighborhoods, for example. This is one of the pieces of evidence that equity is very much part of this issue, that nature access can be a matter of life and death. Take nature access out of a neighborhood and all of these problems get worse. The age of pandemics obviously offers added incentive for more natural areas in our schools. Social distancing is a lot easier in outdoor learning environments than in containers. there's a story in the New York Times a while back, looked at the 2015 epidemic of tuberculosis in the United States. Outdoor classrooms were a big deal. They had great old photographs of outdoor classrooms on the roofs of high-rise buildings in New York City. We forget so easily. A lot of us have been promoting this idea of outdoor classrooms long before the pandemic because kids tend to learn better there. And there's a lot of reasons for that, including more stimulated senses, using more of their senses than they usually use, that stress reduction, all of that. But with the pandemic, it makes all the sense in the world to have outdoor classrooms. And these can be created pretty quickly. But it's been very hard to convince most school districts to do this. And as best as I can tell, the reason for this is not because they disagree with this, but because the way decisions are made in school districts is often so calcified. There are ways of doing things, and you have all these political forces working on the school districts. It's really a tragedy because I think a lot of, particularly in the higher grades in the high school, my brother is a high school teacher in Eureka, California. And the story he tells about how well equipped his classroom was to deal with the pandemic when he first walked into it last August are pretty horrifying. So given these advances, what's next? And there's many, many more. What's next for researchers and those of us who promote this movement? I think one of the most important focuses for research should be that of equitable access to nature by people of different cultural and racial and economic backgrounds. While the human need for nature connection is universal, equal access to nature is not. According to a 2016 study by researchers from the University of Michigan and the University of Montana, African American, Hispanic, and low-income children are more likely to be exposed to toxins in their schools, which are often built on cheap land next to highways, factories, and contaminated sites, areas not conducive to outdoor learning or play. This year, the coronavirus pandemic underscores how inequitable the distribution of parks and nature is. It's going to contribute this new awareness, I think, or not so new, but growing awareness, that as we rethink urban design, as we rethink how we will upgrade our neighborhoods, all of them, including the decaying inner city, the decaying rings of suburbia, not only inner city neighborhoods. More nature in those neighborhoods is a way to prepare for the next pandemic. Biodiversity, healthy biodiversity, tends to be a barrier to pandemic disease. And it also produces human health, as for some of the reasons that I mentioned before. There's some question about what the correct dose should be of nature, of what I call vitamin N, the second of the books that I did on this, or the third actually. The second was Nature Principle, which is about the adult connection to nature and what a society would look like if we spent as much time immersed in nature as we do in technology. The third one is called Vitamin N. It's one of those books that I don't like to read, which is 500 things that families and individuals and health providers and others can do to connect families to nature. And I discussed the dose thing. There's one study found that a minimum of 120 minutes a week in parks, woodlands, or beaches promotes physical and mental health and well-being. Another one said just 15 minutes outdoors daily has a significant. I'm hesitant to endorse the right dose because, as you know, which nature? What's the weather like that day? It's so hard to control those variables. So my prescription is some is better than none and more is better than some. any case, this movement has grown. Pediatricians and other doctors have been extraordinarily important in it. One of the leaders is in Seattle. Well, many of the leaders are in Seattle. But one of them is Howie Frumkin, who is the former head of the University of Washington's public health program. Before that, he was the head of the CDC Center for Environmental Health. And he's been a proponent of this for 20 years. And he also links this to climate change. We now face what I like to call the four horsemen of the apocalypse. One of them is obvious, the climate challenge, biodiversity collapse, pandemics, future pandemics, and human loneliness, human disconnection from nature and from each other. Those four horsemen are essentially riding one horse. So many of the things that we could do about any one of those will help the others. Planting forests as carbon sinks helps produce health in human beings, helps reduce or slow the biodiversity collapse, helps us feel less alone in the world. That's just one example. There's example after example of how we can improve our schools, our neighborhoods, our cities, by dealing with these four horsemen. Control Nature Network is now working with cities all over the country in partnership with the National League of Cities, which represents about 18,000 mayors and other city officials and municipal officials around the country. Doing three things. This is a multi-year effort to define what it means to be what I call a nature-rich city, a nature that's filled, a city that's filled with nature, purposefully filled with nature, not only for people, but for the wildlife that lives in that nature and creating wildlife corridors and so forth. Seattle has done quite a bit of that. I would argue not enough, but quite a bit. The second thing is to find out how to measure that over time. And the third is, how do we train future mayors to make sure their cities are nature rich? Again, dealing with all four of those horsemen. I think probably I would like to end here. I have stories to tell, but I'm not sure I'll have enough time to tell those about our connection to other animals. So maybe we could shift to the questions, and I'll give me a little more time for the storytelling.
Suzanne, you got it? You there?
Yep, I'm here.
Good.
Thanks so much. I'll give people some time to write the questions in the chat. We have lots of time for storytelling as well. So thanks. Looking for questions.
Well, those are coming in. Let me tell you a couple stories. You know, I talk about research a lot, and that's not nearly as interesting as the stories. The most recent book, which I'm shamelessly promoting right there, I worked on for 4 years, the hardest book I've ever done. It's about how our relationships with other animals can transform our lives and help save theirs in the process. I collected stories from not only the United States, but other countries as well, about two things. One is, how do relationships with animals, particularly pets, affect people over time? What stories do people tell about that? The other thing I collected stories on, and many more stories than on the domestic animals, was on wild animals. There's quite a bit of research on how domestic animals affect our health. In fact, animal-assisted therapy is one of the fastest growing areas in therapy. But wild animals, the coyote that walks through your backyard and you have eye contact with, even if it's just for a few seconds, some of these experiences, I think, have a profound impact on us. And I heard that from many people. And many of these people had told me their stories of animal encounters, particularly wild animals, and I never told anybody because they're a little embarrassed by them. One story was told to me by Paul Dayton, who's an oceanographer, very famous among oceanographers, who lives in San Diego, works at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. When he was going to school at the University of Washington, he's about 80 now, he at the University of Washington, he was out in the ocean one day at the bottom of the ocean collecting samples, starfish samples, as well as lunch. He was a starving student. And he had his face to the sand, and he felt something very large come above him. He just sensed it. And then stop. That's usually not a great sign. So he looked up and he saw a big tentacle coming down. Looked up over here, another tentacle coming down. He looked, and at the risk of anthropomorphizing, he said it was one of those huge Pacific octopuses with a 12-foot wingspan, and it looked down at me and it had decided I was a clam, and it came down and got me. And it did. And Paul says that people think that those arms of an octopus are soft or anything, but he couldn't move them. He did what prey does in the mouth of the predator, often the gazelle in the mouth of the lion. He instinctively, unwillingly relaxed. And as he did, the octopus relaxed just a little bit. And so Paul, right then, realized he was running out of oxygen. So he kicked off the bottom of the ocean as hard as he could. He and the octopus went up, up, up in the spiral of water, in this spiraling up through the water. As they did, the octopus moved around Paul's body. He could feel the razor sharp beak of the octopus coming around his neck until he could look right into the octopus's eye. At that point, Paul, hardcore scientist, said something shifted, something changed right then. And the octopus released its grip on him and pulled back. And right then they both, maybe it was just because they're close to the surface. Paul doesn't come up with an ultimate reason for this, but he says they both hit the surface at the same time. The octopus began to sink. He looked down into the water, having ripped off his mask, gasping for air, and saw that the octopus was still looking at him. They were making eye contact. And the octopus kept going down. And what does Paul do at that point? He puts his mask on and he chases the octopus down into the depths until he ran out of breath again and he races to the top. I said, Paul, why in the hell would you have done that? That's crazy. And he again, hardcore, highly respected scientist who says he's 80 now, so he doesn't care about the criticism that will come from his fellow scientists. He says, he used the word spiritual. Something happened there. Something happened. And he doesn't try to pin that down. What he does know is that he did not want those moments to end. I heard that from person after person who told me the stories of their connection to animals, their experience. Two other brief stories. One is a woman in Toronto, a mother, told me how she walked into the living room once and her 6-year-old son was stretched out on the carpet next to their big dog named Jack, who was also stretched out. And her son had his arm around the dog. And she heard her son say, Mommy, I don't have a heart anymore. And she says, what are you saying? And her son, without looking up, arm still around the dog, said, my heart is in Jack. What is that? We've all experienced that with people. permeability between two beings. I make the case in our wild calling that we feel that with animals too. And not only with our pets, we feel it with wild animals as well. Those few seconds, something happens. Person after person told me in different words, sometimes almost exactly the same words about kind of the altered state that would go into it. That had to do with time. Often time either bends or disappears during those experiences. Some of you have had those experiences. Last story. I was on a lake one day in my little boat. I have a little electric trolling motor. It's very quiet. I saw on the shore what I thought were two turkey vultures, but I wanted to look at it. They were eating a fish, and I wanted to look at them closer. So I ease in very quietly 20 feet from them. You don't usually get within 20 feet of golden eagles. They were not turkey vultures. So for what seemed like forever, remember, time bends or kind of disappears in these experiences. The eagles would lean down, get a bite of their fish, and then look up at me. Never, their eyes never leaving mine. Again and again, and this went on forever. And I felt that shift that so many said they felt in those moments. I went home and told my son, who was home from college that weekend. This is Matthew, my son, who I knew he had the fishing gene when he was 3 because I caught him fishing in the humidifier. I said, Matthew, whoever I am, I'm not. Whoever I was in those moments, encountering those eagles, is actually who I am. And I can't explain that with the language that I have. I asked person after person about that experience to explain it. It's much easier to have when you're a kid. And they struggled to explain it, but they all had something like that. The closest I could get to that is a great essay by the philosopher Martin Buber. I always have to be careful not to say Justin Bieber. Martin Buber wrote a great essay called I and Thou. It's about people. He said that you and I don't actually exist. What exists is right here. It's the relationship. And without that relationship, you and I don't actually exist. He used that word in a different way than most of us use. He considered that thing between us as a kind of electricity that some people call God. That's what people describe to me in different words again and again. I like to name things. So this hasn't been looked at in terms of a relationship with other animals very much. So I named that space between us and other animals the habitat of the heart. I think there are 2 habitats. One is the physical, natural habitat that we spend so much time and effort and hard work trying to protect, as we should, and teaching our children about, as we should. The other habitat is the habitat of the heart, and we spend very little time protecting and nurturing and honoring and teaching our children about that. The thing is that if one of those habitats goes, so does the other one. I think this has a lot to do with the future of environmentalism, with conservation, with our relationship with the earth, with our ability to survive on the earth. We need to start paying attention to both habitats. I'll stop there. We may have run out of time. Hopefully there's still a couple questions.
Yeah, there is. Thank you. I'm getting to my chat from Dr. Walker Harding. Thank you so much for your talk today. Have you seen examples of residency programs incorporating nature into their training curriculum and or teaching how to highlight nature and working with families and children? Great question.
There's a health provider in Oakland that I wrote about, and I'm sorry I can't remember her name. If you look up, I wrote a piece last year for Sierra Magazine. It was a cover article in which I argued for something I've been arguing for about 12 years, which is that we need to consider this a human right. If all of that research is true, if E.O. Wilson is correct in saying that this is hardwired into our genetics to have this need, this affiliation, then this is fundamental to our humanity. And anything that fundamental should be considered a human right. That article is wrapped around this health provider organization that has actually gotten insurance companies to cover this. And they enroll not just pediatricians, they enroll physicians who take kids to parks themselves with other adults. And they do this not only for the kids, but for themselves, and also to learn more about this connection to nature and why it's so important to our health. And she says the people who respond the most to it often are the adults, the healthcare providers who go on these expeditions into nature, into the parks. I don't know if they have residences in that program, but we need to do that. It's a great question. I think I should do some investigating to find out if that's taken off yet. We also need teaching teachers when they're in teaching colleges to take kids outside. Many of them are frightened to take kids outside. And again, many of them are young, of the generation that grew up without a lot of contact with nature. That's another area that we need to start training people in.
Agreed. Thank you. And from Dr. Ellen Pasloff, who's one of our community pediatricians, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I have been prescribing outdoor time in nature for most of my patients during the pandemic based on a previous talk I heard that you gave. They all laugh at first, but I think they take it to heart. Thank you so much for the inspiration.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
That's so great. And then from Dr. Ann Melvin, one of the issues families face in getting out to the parks and the urban outdoors is safety. How does this affect the nature prescriptions you mentioned?
Yeah. As I said, I never pretend it's totally safe out there. In fact, remember the experience of awe depends on a sense of being outside your comfort zone and maybe even a little danger. There's danger everywhere. There's danger inside our houses too. In fact, as the circumference of experience has withdrawn to our front step, I mean, our grandparents went miles from home, some of them. And gradually that border that we were allowed to go to has drawn inward until now it's the front stoop. We need to think in terms of comparative danger. Yes, there's some danger outdoors. But there's also great danger growing up on the couch. As you all know, a danger of child obesity, which is probably now even higher than it was before the pandemic. And by the way, the pandemic, most of the people that had been rushing to the parks and the trailheads are millennials or adults, young adults, and some older adults. Kids are actually getting out less during the pandemic into nature. I did a talk to the staff of LL Bean that they asked me to do, and they said that sales of outdoor equipment and clothing has skyrocketed. It's gone 400% up during the pandemic. For children, it's the opposite. It's dropped. So it's something to keep in mind as we go forward. But to think in terms of comparative risk is a place to start with that.
Absolutely. I believe Dr. Quinn has a comment, so I can turn the microphone over to him if he's ready. And then there is one more question in the chat. I don't hear Hal, so I'll ask this question first and I'll give him some time. So from Dr. Phelps Nishiguchi, thank you so much for your talk. I was fortunate to have a very nature-filled childhood, so I was naturally drawn to your books during my medical training. They've inspired me to keep an open mind about drivers of increased incidence of neurodevelopmental disorders, which is now her specialty, mood well-being, and childhood development in general. I strive to discuss nature and play as foundational to any anticipatory guidance and intervention plan that I discuss with my patients. Thanks for sharing the ways that cities and pediatricians have embraced nature, whether as an official prescription or not. One movement that I love in clinic and school-based gardening, which brings together time outdoors and nutrition, another critical foundational element of healthy living.
Absolutely. Thank you.
That's a great comment. Thanks, Erica.
Suzanne, can you hear me now?
Hey, Hal, I can.
I had not unmuted. I think one of our biggest challenges in this regard is digital devices and screen time. And I'll tell a quick story. Not that long ago, my son was an adult, as a matter of fact. We're walking along and he's looking for Pokemon because Pokemon Go had come out and he's looking for Pokemon. We're outside. He's walking along the screen device. I see two dragonflies mating, and I am fascinated by this. And he just shakes his head at me like, Dad, good gosh. And so I think that somehow Pokemon Go and the weird creatures that are in these mystical worlds that aren't real are more interesting than nature. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges. And I think we have to happen early on because screen devices are so addictive. So we've got to get these screen devices out of kids' hands, at least for a period of time, and get them outside.
Overall, I agree with that. But something I said from the beginning is that we have to be careful to do that without demonizing the devices that they love. And there's a practical reason. Anytime adults demonize anything, that's what kids want to do more of. But also the Pokemon thing is interesting. When that first, swarmed the nation, the New York Times asked me to do an op-ed about it, and I looked into it, not knowing anything about Pokemon. I called my younger friends, and as it turned out, and some research showed that this was true, some kids, some young people were using it to report animals that they saw, real animals. And there was a biologist. He set up a Twitter account so that people could do the hashtag and they could report and show the pictures, because I think you can take pictures with that game. I don't know exactly. I've never done it myself. I should. And although it has faded, by the way, you don't hear much about it anymore. But I thought that was an interesting way to incorporate technology. And in Vitamin N, I have a section on that. And there are a lot of ways you can still use technology and cope with it. Both use it in terms of digital cameras. I'm a big fan of. I take my iPhone, which is the best camera I have now. Every time I go for a walk, I take it and I come back with images, and it helps me see things because I'm looking for. So I think that there are ways to encourage that. Another thing, in Vitamin N, there's a thing somebody told me about what they call bracketing. When they take their kids to a park or an outdoor experience, they bracket the experience. They say to the kids in the car, okay, you got a half hour, go for it. Get on your devices and do anything you want. Maybe not go to the porn sites, but do everything you want. And then they take them outside on the adventure, leave the devices at home, and the kids in the car. And the kids know that when they get back in the car, they can go for it again. So that's a way to divide up the time a little bit in a rational way that, the kids can understand.
There we go. Thank you so very much. Wonderful talk, wonderful work. Thank you for helping us try to get reconnected with nature. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Hal. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to everybody who came.